Elias sat at the bar, a solitary figure in the dimly lit tavern. His eyes were cast downward, focusing on the amber liquid swirling in the bottom of his whiskey glass. The only sounds were the occasional clink of ice and the muffled murmurs of the few patrons scattered about. His thoughts were a tumultuous storm, and the whiskey was the only thing that could quiet them. He had hoped for a night of solitude, a chance to drown his troubles before they consumed him. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The door to the tavern creaked open, allowing a waft of cool evening air to sweep in and briefly stir the stale atmosphere. A man around Elias's age sauntered in, his steps unhurried and his gaze intent. He was dressed in a simple, yet well-tailored suit that suggested an air of quiet sophistication. He scanned the room, and his eyes locked on Elias. With a knowing smile, he made his way over to the bar. Elias felt the weight of the man's approach and couldn't help but roll his eyes. The last thing he needed tonight was small talk, especially after the soul-crushing events of the day. The man looked like the type who could spin a yarn for hours, and Elias had no patience for it. He took a deep breath, bracing himself for the inevitable. "Hello there," the newcomer said, extending a hand. "My name is Victor." Elias took the offered hand, giving it a firm but perfunctory shake. "Elias," he murmured, hoping that would be the extent of the interaction. But Victor was not easily deterred. He slid onto the stool next to Elias, his movements as smooth as the whiskey that slid down Elias's throat. "Rough day?" he asked, nodding towards the empty glass. Elias eyed him warily. "You could say that," he replied, his voice laced with a hint of resentment. He didn't owe this stranger his life story. Victor's smile never wavered. "Well, I hate to see a man suffer in silence. Care to share?" He gestured to the bartender for 2 more whiskeys, his voice as smooth as velvet. "This one's on me," the newcomer voiced, gaining a curious yet welcoming stare from Elias. The two sat in silence for a moment until Victor finally asked, "So what seems to be the problem today, old friend?" Elias grunted, his gaze still fixed on the amber liquid. "Just the usual," he said, his voice a mix of resignation and bitterness. "Work, women, the whole damn circus." Victor's smile remained in place as he casually slid a black business card across the bar's scarred surface. The card was as enigmatic as the man himself, with only 2 words etched in a sleek, silver font, blackout. Elias picked up the card, his curiosity piqued despite his desire to be left alone. The edges felt sharp against his fingertips, as if the card was a gateway to something dangerous and alluring. He raised his eyes to meet Victor's, who was now leaning back in his seat, watching him with an unreadable expression. Victor then continued to speak as Elias peered back down to the card. "I would like to offer my services to you, free of charge. We take all your worries and stress away for 1 whole hour. Consider this gesture a promotion for my product." And after a few seconds, while looking down at the card, Victor whispered, "Just give it some thought. We're only in town for 1 night. Trust me, old friend, you won't regret it. And after your experience, I promise you, you will never have to worry about a thing ever again." And after a few moments passed by, Elias looked up at Victor to pose a question. But that was when he noticed Victor was gone. Elias then flipped the card over and noticed an address on the back. 134 East 4th Street, he whispered as he read the address. "Huh," he thought to himself, "that's right next door." After a brief moment of contemplation, and with the whiskey clouding his judgment, Elias decided to give it a shot. He had nothing to lose, and maybe this mysterious Victor could offer some kind of relief. He took one last sip from his glass, the liquid burning his throat as he swallowed his pride along with it. He slid the card into his pocket and stood up, feeling the room sway slightly. The cool air outside slapped him in the face like a cold, wet towel. It was a stark contrast to the stuffy heat of the tavern, and it helped to clear his head somewhat. He stumbled slightly as he stepped onto the cobblestone street, the dim lights from the bar casting eerie shadows on the buildings around him. Looking around, he spotted the address Victor had given him, a nondescript door tucked between two dilapidated stores. Above the door was a flickering neon sign, the letters spelling out blackout in a staccato rhythm that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The sign was the only source of light on this otherwise deserted street, casting a sickly glow over the surrounding area. Elias felt a shiver run down his spine, but he pushed his doubts aside and approached the door. With a creak that echoed through the stillness, the door swung open. He stepped inside, and the heavy darkness of the warehouse enveloped him like a cloak. Floor beneath his feet was cold and hard, the only sound his own footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. He could feel his heart hammering in his chest, a rhythm that matched the pulsing neon sign outside. The whiskey was doing little to ease his nerves now. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he made out the faintest trace of light, a soft glow emanating from somewhere deep within the belly of the warehouse. It was a beacon in the abyss, beckoning him forward. With each step, the light grew stronger, the air around him charged with a strange anticipation that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The shadows grew less ominous, retreating before the advancing illumination. The light grew brighter, and he found himself standing before a door, slightly ajar, allowing a sliver of warm, welcoming light to spill out onto the cold floor. Above the doorframe, a crimson velvet curtain fluttered slightly, hinting at what lay beyond. Elias took a deep breath, his hand trembling as he pushed the door open. The sight that greeted him was unexpected. A woman, dressed all in black, her hair a cascade of inky waves, sat at a round table in the center of a dimly lit room. She looked up as he entered, her eyes a piercing shade of emerald that seemed to glow in the semi-darkness. She offered a serene smile, which held a hint of curiosity and something else, an unnerving intensity. "Your ticket, sir," she asked, her voice a smooth purr that seemed to resonate through the air itself. Elias's hand went to his pocket, where he had placed a business card. He pulled it out and placed it on the table. "This is all I have," he said, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. But as he looked down, he was amazed to see that the once black business card had transformed. It was now a ticket, the sleek silver font replaced by bold, red letters that spelled out "Admit 1" and "Complimentary Pass." The paper felt thicker, almost like a piece of cardboard, and it was warm to the touch. He couldn't remember seeing the change happen, but there it was. "Good," she said, her smile not wavering. "You're in the right place." She then gestured for him to proceed to the next door as she spoke. "Right through there, sir," she continued. "After your experience, we guarantee you will be a new man. You won't have to worry anymore. You'll never have to work again, and all your needs will be met for the rest of your life." Once entering the room beyond, it was unlike anything Elias had ever seen. Brightly lit with bright white walls, and one chair in the middle in front of a table. As he approached the chair to take a seat, his eyes fell upon what appeared to be a virtual reality headset sitting atop the table. The device was sleek and black, with a hint of silver trim, and it emitted a soft, pulsating glow that seemed to sync with his own heartbeat. A feeling of both fascination and dread filled him. He'd heard of these contraptions before, but never had the desire to try one. They promised experiences that could be as real as life itself, but at what cost? Reluctantly, he sat down, the chair surprisingly comfortable as it molded to the contours of his body. He took a deep breath and slowly lifted the headset, feeling its weight in his trembling hands. The woman's eyes never left him, her gaze both reassuring and unsettling. With a final nod from her, He placed the headset over his eyes and felt the cool embrace of the cushioned padding now around him. The world around him shifted, and suddenly, the stark whiteness of the room was replaced by the desolate landscape of an apocalyptic wasteland. The ground was a tattered mess of dust and debris, the horizon a blend of ash and smoke that blotted out the sun. The air was thick with the smell of burning rubber and scorched earth. The only sound was the distant wail of the wind, carrying with it the echoes of a civilization that once thrived. Elias stood in the center of this post-apocalyptic scene, dressed in a pristine white suit that contrasted sharply with the surrounding destruction. He looked down at his hands, which were unblemished and uncalloused, as if he had never worked a day in his life. A sense of unease began to creep into the back of his mind, but it was quickly overshadowed by the excitement of his newfound reality. In the distance, the unmistakable groan of the undead grew louder. He looked around for a weapon, his eyes finally landing on a very large gun, seemingly discarded amidst the debris. It was a beautiful piece of engineering, gleaming under the harsh, artificial light of the game world. His heart raced as he approached it, the sound of his boots crunching on the desolate ground. He bent down, feeling the cold steel against his fingertips. It was heavier than he expected, but he lifted it with surprising ease. With a grin that was equal parts excitement and skepticism, Elias turned to face the incoming horde. These weren't the shambling, mindless zombies of the movies. These were fast, vicious creatures that bore a disturbing resemblance to the people he saw every day. But here, in this virtual hell, they were his to vanquish. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the gun in his hand, and took aim. The first shot rang out, echoing through the wasteland. The zombie's head snapped back, and it crumpled to the ground, a spray of crimson painting the dust. The next few moments were a blur of motion and sound, the gun's roar, the zombie's snarls, the thump of bodies hitting the earth. He moved with a precision that was uncanny, his movements fluid and deadly as he mowed down the undead. The whiskey had given way to a new kind of high, the rush of adrenaline that came from surviving against impossible odds. With every pull of the trigger, Elias felt the knots in his stomach loosening. The weight of the world, the stress of his job, the pain of his failed relationships, it all seemed to dissipate with each lifeless corpse that fell before him. The gun was an extension of his arm, and he wielded it with a fierce, cathartic joy. Creatures grew more numerous, but so did his confidence. He was a god in this world, and they were his playthings to destroy. The zombies came in waves, their moans and snarls a symphony of despair that only fueled his determination. The gun grew warm in his hand, but he didn't falter. He moved through the wasteland with a grace that defied the whiskey-induced haze that had led him here. Each step was calculated, each shot precise. The virtual world around him shuddered with each impact, and he reveled in the power he had been granted. Suddenly, he was swept off his feet, tackled by what oddly seemed to be zombies in police uniforms. They handcuffed him as one zombie stabbed him with a needle, injecting him with an unknown fluid. And as this happened, one single word slipped from the arresting police zombie's lips: sleep. Elias then blacked out. He awoke with a start, his body protesting against the restraints that held him in place. His vision was blurry, his head pounding as if a jackhammer had taken up residence in his skull. He was in a prison cell, the metal cuffs biting into his wrists and ankles, the chair's hardness digging into his back. The room was small, no larger than a broom closet, with concrete walls that reflected the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights above. The air was stale, and the faint metallic scent of blood tainted his nostrils. And as Elias looked down, no virtual headset on anymore, he noticed his clothes, torn and bloodstained. That was when a door to the cell block he found himself in opened. It was a prison guard who shouted a few words. Elias Thornburg, you have a visitor. Confused, Elias watched as the guard disappeared, replaced by a man familiar to him. It was Victor from the previous night. Elias began shouting. He began protesting his current situation. He yelled at Victor, "I thought you were going to fix everything. You said I would never have to worry again. Everything would be taken care of. All my needs would be met for the rest of my life." And as Victor approached with a smile, he answered his newest client, "My old friend, don't you see? After your killing spree on 4th Street, you will surely be charged with murdering dozens of people." Victor's smile grew as Elias' heart pounded. "You see, Elias, all my clients are always given exactly what we guarantee: shelter, food, and water for the rest of their lives. All the things a human needs." And as Victor looked into Elias's eyes, one last time he finished his exchange with his client, ending their short-lived business transaction. "Trust me, Elias. Just as promised, you don't have anything to worry about anymore. No more relationships. No more needless jobs. No rent. No bills. All your needs met." And as Elias grew a sad, confused, and worried look, Victor said his final goodbyes. "So long, old friend." So long, old friend. In the town of Westlake, Louisiana, a peculiar evening unfolded in the Bennett household. The aroma of roast chicken and buttered potatoes filled the air, a typical scent for a family dinner. Yet, something was amiss. Mr. Bennett, a man with a usually cheerful disposition, took his seat at the dinner table, his chair scraping against the wooden floor with a jarring sound. His wife and 3 children sat in silence, their eyes downcast, forks poised but unmoving. He looked around the table, trying to discern what had cast this muted spell over this usually lively gathering. His wife, Mrs. Bennett, had prepared a feast, her usual ingredients of love and care found within. But tonight, she offered no kindness and no smiles. The children, Timothy, Rachel, and Samantha, stared at their plates, staring blankly in silent contemplation. The father cleared his throat, attempting to break the uncomfortable silence. His voice echoing through the dining room, he asked his wife how her day was. Mrs. Bennett, a woman whose laughter was usually the heartbeat of the home, didn't respond. Instead, she just stared at him, the ice cubes in her drink clinking gently against the glass as they continued to melt, along with his attempts to speak to his family. The children remained mute, their eyes flicking up briefly before returning to their food. The father's smile faltered, his eyes darting from one face to the next. He had come home early from work to surprise them, even picked up a box of chocolate chip cookies for dessert. but his efforts seemed to have landed on deaf ears. Mr. Bennet felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The silence was deafening, the weight of it pressing down on his shoulders. He took a deep breath, trying to understand the sudden coldness that had invaded his house. With a sigh, he pushed back his chair and stood up. The legs scraped the floor again, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. He began to clear his dishes, the clank of the silverware against the plates, a stark contrast to the quiet. His movements were deliberate, his mind racing with questions and confusion. He glanced over his shoulder at his family, hoping for a change in their demeanor. But as he watched, they remained eerily still. It was as if they were mannequins in a museum display, frozen in time. His children's eyes remained on their food, each still having not so much as taken a single bite. His wife's hand resting below her glass, the ice long since melted into a pool of water that reflected the flickering candlelight, dancing above its waxy home, the centerpiece of the feast before her. He tried to shake off the unease that had settled in his chest, attributing it to a long day at the office and his own overactive imagination. Perhaps they are just deep in thought. Perhaps they are worried about what has been happening in their small community. A serial killer at large. They call him the Shadowman. The entire community was on alert. Neighbors, friends, and family, all terrified of this threat within their town. Hoping that this was it, he smiled, knowing that his family, although worried, would be safe. He would never let anything happen to them. With a forced smile, Mr. Bennet excused himself, retreating to the sanctuary of his bedroom. He lay down on the cool sheets, his mind racing with thoughts of what he could have possibly done to warrant such a reaction from his loved ones. He tried to convince himself it was just the worry of this threat, just a family terrified of the fear it instilled. But he would keep his family safe. Soon they would realize this, he thought. Soon they would feel safe, knowing that he would secure their home and would never let anything hurt his loved ones. As the minutes ticked by, his eyes grew heavy with the weight of the unspoken words that lingered in the air. Once drifting off to sleep, Mr. Bennet felt the surrounding and eerie stillness of his home become tranquil, inducing a peaceful slumber, a safe retreat from the recent sense of despair. He laid still as his mind began to slip into a relaxing darkness. Suddenly, the quiet was shattered by the sound of his bedroom door being violently thrown open. His heart hammered in his chest as several dark figures, silhouetted by the hallway lights, burst into the room. He bolted upright, his eyes wide with shock and fear as the flashlights blinded him, the beams bouncing off the walls and ceiling like a strobe in a nightclub of his worst fears. His senses on high alert, he could make out the unmistakable shapes of guns pointed at him, ready to unleash a chaos that didn't belong in this peaceful suburban home. They yelled to him to get on the ground. The voice was commanding, authoritative, and Mr. Bennet now had no doubt this voice belonged to the police. But why? Why are police in his house? His mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle that had invaded his home. As he squinted through the glaring lights, the figures came into focus. 2 police officers, dressed in tactical gear, had stormed into his room. Their faces were stern, their eyes unwavering. He felt a cold handcuff snap around his wrists, jolting him into reality. The cold metal bit into his skin, a stark reminder that this was no nightmare. The officers read him his rights as he stared at them in disbelief. "What's happening?" he thought to himself. The words hung in his mind, unanswered. His eyes darted to the blood-soaked bed, his mind reeling with horror. It couldn't be. It just couldn't. But there it was, a crimson stain seeping into the fabric, along with the silent screams of violence. His wife and children's faces flashed before his eyes, their blank expressions now haunting him in a new, terrifying light. Panic surged through his veins as the reality of the situation set in. The officers tightened their grip on his arms and led him out of the room, down the hallway. Each step felt like a mile, his legs heavy with dread. His eyes caught a glimpse of Timothy's bedroom door, slightly ajar. The sight that greeted him was a horror show worthy of a Hollywood slasher. The room was a canvas of red, splattered across the walls with dark blood pooling on the floor. His son's bed was overturned, the mattress slashed and stained. But Timothy himself was nowhere to be seen. They descended the staircase, Mr. Bennet's heart racing with every step. Crimson trail grew thicker, painting a macabre picture on the once pristine beige carpet. The bloodstains on the steps were unmistakable, a grim path that led down to the ground floor. Rachel and Samantha's bedroom doors were open, both rooms in a similar state of disarray, their beds drenched in a crimson hue. Yet, there was no sign of his daughters. The house felt like a tomb, filled with the scent of iron and fear. And as they rounded the corner, that was when he saw it. His family was still at the dinner table, but the scene was far from the warm, inviting picture he had left. Their bodies were lifeless, propped up in their chairs as if in a grisly play. Blood had been meticulously smeared on their faces, giving them grotesque smiles that didn't reach their vacant eyes. Their arms were glued to the table, fingers curled around their silverware, which was stained a dark red. The sight was so surreal, so horrifying, that for a moment he thought it couldn't be real. But then, he noticed something that snapped him out of his daze and brought him back to reality. The real Mr. Bennet was there, in the center of the living room, tied to a chair, his clothes torn and bloodied. An officer and a paramedic working quickly to free him, their movements a blur of urgency. Mr. Bennet's eyes were wide with terror, his chest heaving as he took in great, ragged breaths. The imposter looked at the father, his own eyes filled with a dawning realization. The true Mr. Bennet had been forced to watch his impersonator commit the unspeakable, to feel the agony of losing his wife and children while being powerless to stop it. And then, finally, the shadowman smiled as he was escorted out of the Bennet's home, a wake of bloody horror behind him. "You're sure this is the right turn?" Marcus squinted at the faded road sign, written in a script he couldn't read. The air was thin and cold, the sun a mere smudge of white behind the clouds. "The GPS hasn't failed us yet," Daniel replied, tapping the dashboard screen. His voice echoed in the confined space of the truck. The road grew steeper, the gravel crunching under the tires, a chorus of loose gravel. Marcus gripped the handle above the window, his knuckles whitening. He wasn't used to these kinds of heights. His gaze flickered to the sheer drop beside them, the valley, a stomach-churning abyss that seemed to yawn wider with every twist of the road. The truck jolted, sending a spray of dust and pebbles tumbling down the mountain. Marcus swallowed hard, his eyes snapping back to the road ahead. The driver, a stoic Tibetan native named Tenzin, remained unfazed. He'd been navigating these treacherous paths for decades, it seemed. His hands were steady on the wheel, his eyes focused on the path ahead. As they climbed higher, the sparse vegetation gave way to a stark, rocky landscape, punctuated only by the occasional prayer flag, fluttering like colorful ghosts in the wind. The air grew thinner, and Marcus found himself gasping for breath. Daniel, ever the optimist, rolled down the window, letting in a gust of chilly air. "It's incredible, isn't it?" he said, his eyes alight with excitement. "Imagine living up here, so close to the heavens." Marcus nodded, his eyes still on the unforgiving terrain. "It's certainly remote." "Yeah," Daniel said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "But do you think he's really the reincarnation of Christ?" Marcus took a moment to consider the question, his eyes never leaving the winding path ahead. "I don't know. It's a lot to take in, but the evidence is quite convincing." "You're referring to the prophecy," Daniel said, his voice a mix of skepticism and hope. Marcus nodded. "The scripture is clear, and we must read him these words within the scripture. We must see for ourselves, my old friend. If the child's eyes light up when we read it, then we'll know for sure." Daniel fumbled in his bag, pulling out a well-worn, ancient-looking book. He carefully turned the pages, his thumb lingering over the gold-leaf script. "Here it is," he said. "The prophecy of the Son of the Heavens." Marcus leaned in, his curiosity piqued. The scripture was written in Aramaic, a language as ancient as the prophecy itself. Marcus, unlike Daniel, understood the age-old dialect. He had studied it for months, translating it piece by piece, memorizing the words that would supposedly illuminate the truth in the eyes of the child. "The time has come," Marcus began, his voice carrying a solemn weight that seemed to press down to the very air inside the truck. "The heavens have sent forth their Son, concealed in the flesh of a child born in the east. His eyes shall be as stars, his countenance a beacon of hope to the lost." Tenzin glanced at them in the rearview mirror, with a darkness to his eyes the men had not seen. The engine whined as the truck lurched over a particularly steep incline. Marcus felt his heart rate spike, but he didn't dare interrupt. This was a moment that had been centuries in the making, and he wasn't about to spoil it with his fear of heights. They rounded a bend, and the monastery appeared before them, nestled in a cleft of the mountain, like a jewel in a dragon's lair. It was smaller than Marcus had pictured, but no less majestic. The whitewashed walls gleamed in the weak sunlight, and the gold roof tiles glimmered with a promise of sanctity within. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. This was it, the culmination of their journey. If the prophecy was true, the fate of the world rested on this one small boy. And if it was false, well, they had come too far to even contemplate such a thought. Finally, coming to a stop, they climbed out of the truck, the chilly air biting at their cheeks. The monastery loomed above them, a man-made hulk watching over the mountainous landscape. Marcus felt a sudden weight on his shoulders, a burden heavier than the altitude. If the boy was not the reincarnation, if they had been wrong, the implications were dire. A millennium of darkness stretched out before mankind, with no savior to guide them through the ruins of their own making. As they approached the arched wooden doors, a sense of foreboding settled in Marcus's gut. Prophecy was clear. If the child's eyes did not light up at the reading of the sacred words, the world would be plunged into a millennium of despair. He tried to shake off the thought, focusing instead on the warmth of the sun on his back and the rhythmic crunch of their boots over the gravel below. The doors swung open, revealing a courtyard filled with monks in crimson robes, their heads shaved and faces serene. They parted to make way for the two Westerners and their guide, their eyes curious but unreadable. The air was thick with the scent of incense, while the sound of chanting served as a soothing backdrop to the cacophony of their own thoughts. Marcus and Daniel were led to a small, dimly lit chamber where the sought-after boy sat cross-legged on a cushion, surrounded by ancient texts and religious artifacts. He couldn't have been more than 5 years old, with round cheeks and a mischievous glint in his eyes that seemed out of place in such a sacred setting. The monks whispered among themselves as the two men approached, the child's gaze never leaving them. He was the key to everything they had sought, the answer to a question that had haunted the corners of their minds for months. Marcus felt the weight of their mission pressing down on him, the need to unlock the truth within this innocent vessel. "We've come a long way," Daniel quietly said to himself, his eyes never leaving the boy. "Too far to leave without answers." Marcus nodded, his gaze flicking to the monks who had gathered around them. They whispered among themselves, their eyes darting from the two men, then to the child, and back once again. There was something in their expressions that made Marcus's skin crawl. Hope, fear, anticipation. It was as if they could see an invisible aura surrounding the boy, one that screamed of divinity. Daniel took a step forward, the heavy book clutched tightly in his hands. His voice was low, a mere echo that seemed to resonate through the very air of the chamber. "We've come to speak to him," he announced to the monks. "We've come to see the boy, the one claimed to be our savior. And we've come to see if this prophecy holds true. We come from Rome. We come with urgency and an open heart of our collective clergy, the Vatican City." The monks fell silent. Their chanting abruptly ceased. Marcus felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end as each of them turned to face them, their faces a sea of identical ominous grins. It was a sight that sent ripples of unease down through his soul, one that made him question the very essence of their mission. Ignoring the unsettling atmosphere, however, they approached the boy regardless, their steps echoing through the chamber. His eyes, a piercing blue, met theirs, unblinking and unwavering. He looked so innocent, so normal. Could this truly be the reincarnation of the Son of God? Marcus felt his heart racing as Daniel began to recite the sacred text. The words, foreign yet powerful, filled the room. The monks leaned in, their whispers now hushed. The boy's expression remained unchanged, his gaze fixed on the book as if it held all the secrets of the universe. "The one born of the divine union," Daniel continued, his voice gaining strength, "will be recognized by the wisdom of his words and the purity of his heart." Marcus watched the child, searching for any flicker of recognition, any sign that these ancient words held a truth within them. The boy's gaze shifted, moving from the book to Daniel's face, then to Marcus. His expression remained unchanged, a mask of childish curiosity.
"Do you not understand? Is this me which you speak of?"
he asked, his voice small and unassuming. Marcus felt his heart lurch as he replied to the child before him. "You, my son, you are the reincarnation of Krishna, the savior that the Christians call Christ. Show yourself to me." The room then grew eerily dark, the shadows of the clouds outside stretching their inky fingers through the monastery windows. The wind picked up, howling like a pack of lost souls. The heavy wooden doors of the chamber slammed shut with a thunderous boom, rattling the ancient artifacts lining the walls. Marcus's eyes widened as he took in the sudden change in the atmosphere. The monks' faces contorted into twisted grins, and their laughter rose to a cacophonous crescendo that bounced off the stone walls, which filled the room with a malevolent glee. Their tranquil countenances were gone, replaced by snarling expressions that seemed to come from a nightmare. The chanting grew louder, more frenzied, and the air grew thick with a sense of malice that was palpable. Daniel stumbled back, dropping the sacred text. The pages fluttered to the ground like leaves in a storm, their gold script shimmering briefly before being swallowed by the shadows. And then a deep growl, as if from the devil himself, was heard as Marcus and Daniel laid their eyes back on the small boy, his eyes now a deep, deep black. The two of them found their world spinning as they looked to all sides, an eerie chamber of menacing stares. The doors to the chamber burst open with a sound like thunder as the two men found themselves running, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The monks just stood and stared as the men fled for their lives, their laughter now a terrifying yet fading choir behind them that seemed to resonate from the very stones themselves. Now, racing to their vehicle, Marcus yelled at the driver, his eyes wide with fear. "Tenzin, what is this place? Where have you taken us?" Tenzin grew a faint smile as he replied. "You must leave," he said in Aramaic, the ancient words rolling off his tongue like a warning from a long-forgotten era. "This place is not for you." Marcus and Daniel stared at him, stunned. The monks making it clear that they were unwelcome was one worry alone. But Tenzin's sudden change in demeanor was much more unnerving. He climbed back into the truck and revved the engine, pointing back the way they had come, pointing to the monastery. He then said a few last words in the ancient tongue, and then, leaving the two men stranded, Tenzin made his shocking yet inevitable departure. Marcus and Daniel exchanged horrified glances as the reality of the situation began to dawn on them. "What did he say?" Daniel panted, his eyes darting between Marcus and their retreating would-be return trip. Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper. "He said, 'You must leave. This place is not for you.'" Daniel's eyes spelled utter confusion as he continued to seek more answers. "But what about the boy?" Marcus's voice was grim. "The prophecy was a trap. We've been fooled." The men looked at the monastery, their veins flushed with an icy cold wave as they looked upon it to see what could only be described as the Dark Lord's palace. They had been played like pawns in some cosmic game, and now they found themselves on the wrong side of the board. The monastery above them, once a bastion of peace and tranquility, now loomed like a castle of shadows, the sun's light seemingly unable to penetrate its walls. The wind grew stronger, carrying with it an unmistakable scent of brimstone and decay. Marcus spoke once more, his voice trembling much worse, slowly finishing explaining the last of what Tenzin had said before he drove off. He then said, "You have awoken him. You have awoken the Dark Prince." He fell silent only to snap out of his daze with urgency, feeling the walls closing in on them. "We must leave, now." They turned on their heels and sprinted down the mountain path, their boots slipping on the loose gravel. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, as if the very earth was rejecting them. The truck was a distant speck, retreating down the snaking road, and Tenzin was nowhere to be seen. Marcus's heart hammered in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. What did he mean? "We don't belong here. Then who is the boy? Is he not who he was claimed to be?" Daniel panted, his eyes never leaving the looming monastery. Marcus's heart sank as he translated the rest of Tenzin's words. "The Antichrist," he uttered. "We've been pawns, Daniel." We've been brought here to complete some twisted prophecy. We've been played, Marcus shouted, his eyes filled with horror as he stared up at the monumental edifice. But why? Daniel asked, his voice strained, his mind racing. Marcus didn't have an answer, his eyes transfixed on the upside-down cross etched into the side of the mountain, a mockery of their quest. We were the ones they were waiting for, he murmured. The laughter of the monks grew louder, the sound echoing through the valleys like a hellish hymn. The wind howled even more, carrying with it the malevolence of all the devil soldiers. Daniel looked at Marcus, his face pale. What do we do now? Marcus took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving the upside-down cross. We have to warn the world, he said, his voice steady despite the fear that clutched at his heart. We have to tell them what we have seen here. We must tell them what we have unleashed. As if in response, the shadows grew denser around them, coalescing into a single, towering figure. The dark apparition was human-shaped, yet not human at all. Its eyes burning with a cold, unearthly light. The figure stretched out a hand, its palm facing the two men, and spoke in a language that seemed to resonate through their very bones.
Sleep,
it hissed, the word illustrating a command rather than a suggestion. Marcus and Daniel whipped around, their eyes widening at the sight of the looming figure. It was taller than any man, a silhouette of shadow and malice that seemed to drink in the light. The creature's hand was now stretched out, nearly in striking distance of the two, its fingers splayed in a gesture of power. The air grew even thicker and heavier with the building scent of sulfur and decay. Marcus felt his knees buckle, his legs refusing to hold his weight.
Sleep.
The figure's voice hissed once more, a command that echoed through the valleys, resonating in their very bones. It was a sound that bypassed their ears and went straight to their core, a siren's call that they could not resist. Daniel's eyes rolled back in his head, his body going limp. Marcus tried to fight it, to cling to consciousness, but it was like trying to hold back a tsunami with a single hand. His vision swimming in blurs and fading lights, the world around him soon dimming to solid black. When Marcus awoke, his world was agony. His wrists and ankles were bound, his body stretched taut against cold, unyielding stone. His eyes stitched open, and the first thing he saw was Daniel, a mirror image of his own predicament, nailed to the opposite wall. They were in a chamber, the walls lined with ancient scriptures, the floor sticky with what he didn't dare to think was blood. The stench of rotting flesh filled the room, turning his stomach inside out. The boy then appeared, his eyes still that piercing black, the color of a starless night. He walked through the room with an eerie calm, his bare feet silent on the stone. The monks had simply vanished, evolving into shadows that slithered along the ground like serpents. The boy looked at them, his gaze unwavering, and spoke without moving his lips. The words entered their minds like a whispered curse.
You will be my vessels.
The child's telepathic voice echoed through their skulls.
My demons will inhabit you, and together we will usher in a new era of darkness.
Marcus and Daniel struggled against their bonds, the pain shooting through their bodies like bolts of lightning. The room spun around them, the ancient texts on the walls seeming to writhe and pulse with a malevolent energy. The boy's eyes remained fixed on them, like black orbs that held no trace of humanity. They watched in horror as their limbs began to fade, their flesh receding to reveal the bones beneath. The air grew thick with a viscous substance that clung to them like spider's silk, weaving around their bodies in a cocoon of unholiness. The substance grew denser, heavier, wrapping around their chests, their throats, their faces. They gasped for air, their eyes bulging as the suffocating embrace tightened. The child's laughter could be heard before the world went silent. Marcus felt his consciousness slipping away, the pain receding into a distant memory. He could feel himself becoming nothing. When he opened his eyes again, the chamber was bathed in a crimson light, the walls pulsing with an unearthly energy. Daniel's screams had become a distant echo, lost in that chamber of dark spirits that now filled the room. The boy stood before them, his once innocent features twisted into a grotesque mask of power. His eyes, now pools of blackness, gleamed with malicious intent.
You shall be the hellish sounds of my coming,
He boomed, his voice resonating through the very stones of the monastery.
with all the pain you endure now, and the intense pain and torment to come for the next several days will be the warning sound of my return. And when the world sees what you have become, they will tremble in fear and despair.
Marcus and Daniel watched in horror as their bodies contorted, their forms stretching and morphing into something unrecognizable. Their skin cracked and peeled away, revealing muscles and tendons that bulged and snapped into new, monstrous shapes. The shadows that had once slithered at their feet now coalesced into a writhing mass, sinking into their very beings, transforming them into living nightmares. The boy's final words hung in the air like a death knell, a dark boom that resonated through their twisting bones.
You will not be warning the world of me,
He said, his voice now a deep, otherworldly rumble.
for as you turn into a macabre sight of true terror, unable to recognize yourselves, you will become the very embodiment of fear. In your pain and torment, you will only crave chaos and destruction.
Marcus and Daniel felt the last vestiges of their humanity slipping away as the transformation continued. Their skin was a patchwork of decay, shadows of the recent selves, their eyes now hollow sockets filled with a cold, distant light. And then, a sudden, unexpected voice pierced the darkness as the boy finally spoke aloud, with a tone that seemed to cut through the layers of their pain and terror.
And then, it will be others instead, warning mankind of you.
And then, as if to twist the proverbial knife, the scripture that Marcus had read from fluttered to the ground, landing at their feet. The pages, once pristine and sacred, were now tinged with a dark energy that seemed to pulse in time with their erratic heartbeats. Marcus felt a sudden warmth spread through his being as he looked down to see the ancient text glowing with a fierce, golden light. The shadows retreated, hissing and writhing away from the divine glow. The words on the page shifted and rearranged themselves, the Aramaic script morphing into a language they could both easily understand. A script that had yet to be translated, as the text was simply too faded from all the years in existence. Daniel's eyes widened as he read the newly revealed text aloud, his voice trembling with the weight of the revelation. This is Lucifer's prophecy. It must never be read aloud. His demon will try to tempt you. You must not listen to this demon. You must not follow him. You will know of this demon of which I tell you. You will know him, for this demon's name is Tenzin.